The courtroom was cold and silent, the only sound the faint rustle of papers as Harold Mitchell shuffled in front of the judge's bench. His hands, gnarled and shaking with age, gripped a worn leather briefcase, which contained more than just legal documents. It held the history of his family, deeds from the 1860s, photographs of ancestors who had lived, fought, and worked on the land for generations, and letters filled with hope and despair. It was a lifetime of legacy, and now it seemed it was all slipping away. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Gregory Hawthorne's voice rang out, cutting through the silence. His tone was sharp, dismissive, the kind of coldness that came with decades of power. "You may present your case." Harold's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly stood up, his joints protesting each movement. He was 78 now, with a lifetime of hardship behind him, but his pride and determination still burned brightly. He knew the system wasn't built for men like him. Black, poor, fighting against the tide of powerful developers who had long controlled the city. But this land was his, and he would fight for it until his last breath. "The land my family owns, Your Honor, has been in our possession since the Reconstruction. 3 acres on Oak Creek Road. We've worked it, lived on it, buried our dead there, and now a corporation wants to take it from us, claiming that they own it. But they don't. We have the deeds, and they've been passed down through my family for generations." Judge Hawthorne barely glanced at the papers Harold presented, dismissing them with a wave of his hand. His silver hair gleamed under the bright courtroom lights, and his robe was pristine, the epitome of authority. "Do you have documentation that meets the current legal standards?" he asked, his voice tinged with impatience. "Yes, Your Honor," Harold said, his voice steady despite the growing tension in his chest. "I have the original grant from 1867. My great-grandfather, Elijah Mitchell, was granted this land after he was freed from slavery. His name is on the deed. His legacy is here," Hawthorne scoffed. "This court isn't interested in history lessons, Mr. Mitchell. We deal with the law, and the law says this land now belongs to Brightwell Enterprises. If you want to challenge that, you'd better have something more than sentimental attachments to present." The gallery of onlookers shifted uncomfortably. Harold could feel the weight of their stares, the disapproval that radiated from the court. The room felt smaller with each passing second, as though the walls were closing in on him. This wasn't just about land. It was about dignity. It was about justice. Things that people like him had been denied for far too long. "I've already filed these deeds with the clerk's office," Harold continued, his voice trembling but firm. "They were denied. They told me I needed a simple yes or no form. But how can I reduce my family's history to a mere signature? How can I explain that this land isn't just dirt and stone? It's our past, our future." Hawthorne's expression remained unchanged, his eyes cold and calculating. "If you didn't file the proper documentation, there's nothing we can do. Brightwell Enterprises has provided everything needed to show they hold the legal rights to this property. Your claim lacks merit, Mr. Mitchell." A murmur spread through the courtroom as Harold's heart sank. He knew the system wasn't designed for him to win. He'd seen it too many times before. Powerful men like Hawthorne, siding with developers, pushing aside the concerns of people like him. The law was supposed to be blind, but it wasn't. It never had been. "Your Honor," Harold's voice cracked, but he stood tall. "What about justice? What about what's right? My family fought for this land, built it from nothing. And now they want to erase us, erase our legacy. For what? So Brightwell can make more money?" Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "This court deals with legal statutes, not sentimental notions of justice. The law is clear. Brightwell has submitted proper documents, and they've been approved. You'll be compensated for your land, Mr. Mitchell, but you will not stop this development." "Compensated?" Harold's voice grew louder, but his chest tightened. "How do you compensate a man for his family's legacy? You can't just buy a piece of history. You can't erase the lives that have been lived here." Hawthorne's gavel slammed down. "Enough, Mr. Mitchell. This court finds in favor of Brightwell Enterprises. The injunction is lifted. The development can proceed." Harold stood frozen in disbelief as the gavel echoed in his ears. Tears stung his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He had fought for too long, Too hard to give up now. As the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations, he turned slowly toward the door. It was then that the doors swung open and a woman stepped into the room. Tall, confident, and with a presence that immediately commanded attention, she walked straight to the front of the courtroom, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She was Amara Langston, a civil rights attorney known for her relentless pursuit of justice. Without a word, she placed a sealed file on the clerk's desk and announced, "Your Honor, I am filing an emergency motion to stay this ruling based on newly discovered evidence of judicial misconduct." Harold looked up, a glimmer of hope sparking in his chest. This wasn't over. Not yet. The air in the courtroom grew tense as Amara Langston made her way to the front. All eyes were on her, judges, lawyers, reporters, even the onlookers. She was an imposing figure, dressed in a tailored dark suit that matched her determined expression. But it wasn't just her appearance that commanded respect. It was the weight of the moment. She wasn't just a lawyer. She was a force, a reminder that even the most powerful systems could be challenged. Harold Mitchell watched her, confused but hopeful. Who was this woman, and what did she have in store? Was she the one who could make a difference? For the first time that day, he felt a spark of optimism. "Your Honor," Amara began, her voice unwavering, "I'm filing an emergency motion to stay this ruling based on previously suppressed evidence." She didn't wait for the judge's permission before continuing. "I am here to present new information that proves judicial misconduct in this case, involving not just Judge Hawthorne, but also a conspiracy with Brightwell Enterprises." The room fell silent. Even Judge Gregory Hawthorne, who had exuded an air of invincibility moments before, froze in his seat. His lips tightened as if he had just tasted something bitter, but his eyes betrayed a hint of panic. He knew exactly what was happening. The walls that had protected him for years were beginning to crack. Amara Langston was no ordinary lawyer. She had spent years fighting for civil rights, investigating corrupt practices, and exposing the systemic racism that had long been embedded in the legal system. And now it seemed she had uncovered something that could bring the whole corrupt structure down. The gallery buzzed with whispers, but Amara's presence cut through it all. She wasn't just talking about land ownership. This was about the power of a system that had long upheld the status quo by silencing people like Harold Mitchell. People who had always fought but never been heard. People whose land was stolen through legal loopholes, deceit, and racism. "Judge Hawthorne," Amara's eyes locked onto his, "you have been a part of something far larger than this case. Brightwell Enterprises didn't just acquire land. They systematically stripped Black families of their property. And you, sir, played a pivotal role in ensuring that those families remained disenfranchised." Hawthorne's face darkened, but his posture remained rigid. He refused to show any weakness. "This is highly irregular, Ms. Langston," he said, his voice tight. "You have no right to come in here and make accusations without any formal evidence." His eyes flicked to the folder she had placed on the clerk's desk, but he refused to acknowledge its contents. "I have evidence," Amara responded firmly. "Evidence that connects Judge Hawthorne to Brightwell Enterprises and to a pattern of judicial misconduct that has been ongoing for decades. This is not just about land. It's about corruption and about the systematic erasure of Black landowners." As Amara spoke, she glanced at Harold, who was watching her with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. He had been fighting for his family's land for so long, and now for the first time, someone was fighting alongside him. Someone who understood the true battle wasn't just about ownership of property, but about reclaiming dignity, justice, and history. The room was still. For a moment, even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade. Judge Hawthorne sat back in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. His eyes darted around the room, but he knew the game was up. He had been careful for decades, burying his actions behind legal jargon and power, but now, everything was coming to light. Amara continued, her voice calm but resolute. "This is about justice, Your Honor. Not just for Harold Mitchell and his family, but for every Black family in this county that has lost their land to developers like Brightwell. We have the documentation, we have the witnesses, and we have the proof. It's time the truth came out." She handed over the sealed file to the clerk, who carefully opened it and began distributing copies to the court. The murmurs grew louder as the room saw the evidence Amara was presenting. It was more than just land deeds and legal documents. It was a paper trail that led directly to Judge Hawthorne's office, to Brightwell's executives, and to a network of connections that had ensured land deals were made at the expense of Black landowners, all while using the court as a tool of oppression. Amara knew this wasn't just about a case in a courtroom. This was bigger than that. This was about exposing the cracks in a system that had long protected the powerful and exploited the powerless. And now she had the pieces to prove it. The moment was electric, but Amara knew they couldn't rest on their laurels. Even with this evidence, the fight was far from over. The system would fight back, and Judge Hawthorne was a skilled adversary. But Amara had something else on her side: the truth. "I'm requesting an immediate retrial," she said, her voice steady, "and I'm asking the court to block Brightwell Enterprises from proceeding with the development until all the evidence has been reviewed and the corruption exposed." Harold stood quietly behind her, his heart pounding. He had spent years battling the system, feeling like he was shouting into the void. But now, with Amara Langston leading the charge, he felt the ground beneath him shift. For the first time in a long while, he could see the possibility of justice. As Amara turned to walk back to her seat, she made eye contact with Harold once more. There was a brief, silent understanding between them. This fight was just beginning, but they were no longer fighting alone. The quiet hum of the courthouse faded into the background as Harold Mitchell sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the land he had fought for his entire life. The wind rustled the trees outside, and for a moment he allowed himself to remember, a memory from long ago, a time when he was just a boy, racing against the flames. It was the summer of 1953, and the air was thick with heat. The small house he had grown up in, on the very land he was now fighting to protect, was ablaze. Flames twisted in the air like hungry serpents, licking the wooden frame of their home, threatening to swallow everything. "Get back, Harold!" his father Elijah shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Get away from here!" But Harold was already running toward the front door, the smoke clawing at his lungs. He could hear the faint cries for help coming from upstairs, the voice of a child, scared and trapped. Without hesitation, Harold darted into the burning house, the heat searing his skin as he pressed forward. He didn't think about the danger, didn't hesitate for a second. All that mattered was getting to the little girl who was trapped behind a window, her face pressed against the glass, pounding for someone to save her. He could hear her screaming, her tiny hands smearing the glass in desperation. "Hold on!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. He stumbled, his feet slipping on the hot floorboards, but he kept going. As he reached the stairs, a beam fell just inches from his head, sending a shower of embers down on him. He didn't care. There was no time to think. Upstairs in a small bedroom, he found her, a little girl, no more than 7 years old, her eyes wide with terror as she lay pinned beneath the rubble. The ceiling had collapsed, trapping her. Her frail frame was caught beneath the weight of the fallen debris, and Harold's heart clenched in his chest. Without thinking, he shoved the burning beams aside, ignoring the pain as the splinters dug into his hands. The heat was unbearable, but he didn't stop. With one final push, he scooped her up in his arms, his body burning with every step as he raced back toward the stairs. He could hear his father's voice again, shouting from the front yard, urging him to get out. But Harold couldn't leave her behind. The journey down the stairs was a blur of smoke, heat, and pain. But when he finally burst out into the fresh air, the crowd of neighbors rushed forward, taking the girl from his arms. Harold collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath, his lungs raw from the smoke. The little girl, shaking but alive, was held in her mother's arms. The grateful woman's eyes met Harold's and she whispered, "Thank you. You saved her." But as Harold lay there, exhausted and coughing violently, he looked at the faces of the people around him. The ones who had watched as his family struggled to keep their land, their dignity, their lives. They were the ones who had told him, time and time again, that people like him didn't deserve this land, that the law was never going to be on their side, that his family's fight was futile. But that moment, when he saved the little girl from the fire, was the first time he truly understood the stakes. It wasn't just about fighting for land, It was about fighting for something far greater. It was about the value of a life, the dignity of his family, and the hope that, someday, someone would see them for who they truly were, people worthy of justice. Harold closed his eyes, letting the memory wash over him. The years had passed, but the scars remained. It was the same fight, over and over. And now, standing at the crossroads of yet another battle, he had to face the truth. The law had never worked for people like him. It was never going to. And even when it seemed like victory was within reach, the forces that sought to silence him, to erase his family's history, were still at work. His mind snapped back to the present. He was still holding the briefcase, still clutching the deeds, the family history. And he was still fighting, not just for land, but for the right to be heard, to be seen as more than just another statistic in a system designed to keep him down. But as he thought about Amara Langston, her determined eyes and the fire in her voice, he felt something else stir within him. Hope. It wasn't just the law he had to fight. It was a system, a history of injustice that went deeper than any legal ruling. Amara was more than just a lawyer. She was a reminder that sometimes the fight wasn't lost, even when the odds seemed impossible. She had a purpose beyond her case files. She had a mission to expose the corruption that had run rampant for generations. Corruption that had affected so many families like his, families that had never had a voice. As the sound of footsteps grew louder outside his office, Harold turned to the door, where Amara stood, her confident stance a sharp contrast to the weariness that still lingered in his bones. She had been the one to bring him the evidence, to show him that his fight was worth something more than just a piece of land. "Mr. Mitchell," she said softly, her gaze steady, "we've only just begun." Harold met her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of certainty. Maybe, just maybe, this time, the system would listen. The days following the courtroom revelation were a blur of action and uncertainty. Amara Langston's motion had shaken the foundations of the case, but the battle was far from over. As the dust settled from her bold appearance, she and Harold Mitchell gathered their team. Micah Reed, an investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption, and Isaiah Mitchell, Harold's grandson, whose skills in technology would prove invaluable. In Amara's office, the mood was focused but tense. Evidence had been laid out, but it was clear that the fight would require more than just legal maneuvering. The stakes were too high, and the system they were up against was too entrenched. The weight of centuries of injustice hung over them, but Amara had already made it clear they weren't backing down. Harold sat across from them, his hands wrapped around his father's old leather briefcase, the same briefcase that had held his family's history, their land deeds, and the memory of his ancestors. Now it held the possibility of reclaiming what had been lost, not just land, but dignity, justice, and a place in a future they had been denied for far too long. "We need to find a way to connect Brightwell Enterprises to Judge Hawthorne," Amara said, her voice steady as she leaned over a table filled with case files. "We've established a financial link between Brightwell and the judge, but we need more. We need concrete proof that this wasn't just a one-time thing." Micah, the investigative journalist, nodded as he sifted through a stack of property records. "There's something about this case that doesn't sit right with me. I've been looking into Brightwell's acquisition history. There's a pattern. They've been targeting black landowners, specifically those with long histories on their land. But what's odd is that the land they target is never just any land. It's always valuable, in areas that are ripe for development." Isaiah, who had been scrolling through a laptop, looked up from the screen. "That's the key. Brightwell isn't just acquiring property. They're systematically removing black families from it. And they've been doing it for decades, using the court system as a weapon." Amara's eyes gleamed with determination. "Exactly. And if we can show this pattern of legal manipulation, it's not just a matter of land disputes. It's a deliberate attempt to erase black ownership and perpetuate racial inequality." Harold listened intently, but the weight of the conversation was heavy on his shoulders. He'd spent his life trying to make sense of the world around him, but it had never been this clear. The system, the law, the courtrooms, it had all been stacked against people like him from the beginning. This fight wasn't just for his land, It was for the generations of black families who had been pushed aside, whose land had been stolen, whose voices had been silenced. "This is bigger than us," Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite the burden of the years. "It's always been bigger than us." Amara nodded. "But we're not alone anymore. We've got the evidence, and we've got the truth. All we need is the courage to see it through." Isaiah, who had been quiet for a moment, looked at his grandfather. "We'll get this, Grandpa. We'll expose them for what they are, and we'll get your land back. It's not just for you, it's for all of us." The words struck a chord with Harold. He had never imagined his fight for justice would lead him here, to this place, surrounded by a team that was not only determined, but deeply connected to his cause. He had always fought alone, but now with Amara, Isaiah, and Micah by his side, it felt like they had a real chance. The work was exhausting, the hours long, the research endless, but with every piece of evidence they uncovered, the case against Judge Hawthorne and Brightwell Enterprises grew stronger. They found more connections, more documents linking the judge to illegal deals, more proof of the systematic racism embedded in the very fabric of the legal system. One night, as Amara and Isaiah stayed late in her office, going through a set of encrypted financial records, Isaiah made a breakthrough. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his eyes scanning the screen for any discrepancies. "I've got it," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "Here's the smoking gun. Brightwell has been funneling money into Hawthorne's re-election campaigns for years. Not just small donations, large sums. And it's not just Hawthorne. There are several other local officials tied to this. Brightwell has been greasing the wheels for decades." Amara's heart raced. "This is it. This is what we needed." Isaiah turned the laptop toward Harold, showing him the financial transactions. "It's all here, Grandpa. This is how Brightwell has been able to push through these land acquisitions. They've been buying off the people who are supposed to be serving justice." Harold sat back, his breath catching in his throat. The truth had always been there, hidden in plain sight. But now they had the proof. They had everything they needed to take down the system that had been built to keep them in their place. But even as they celebrated the discovery, they knew the battle was far from over. The system was powerful, and it wouldn't go down without a fight. Brightwell, Judge Hawthorne, and all the people who had benefited from their corruption would fight back, harder than ever before. "We're going to need more than just evidence," Amara said, her voice firm. "We need to take this to the people. We need to make sure that everyone knows what's been happening in our courts, in our communities. We need to make sure that this case is heard." Harold nodded slowly, a sense of resolve settling in his chest. "Then let's make sure they hear it. All of it." The courthouse was packed the day of the final hearing. The walls, once cold and imposing, now seemed to hum with the energy of thousands of unseen voices. Voices that had been silenced for generations, but were now ready to be heard. Outside, protesters marched, their chants of "justice for the land" ringing through the streets. Inside, the fight for that very justice was about to reach its crescendo. Amara Langston stood at the front of the courtroom, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her shoulders. Behind her, Harold Mitchell sat quietly, his weathered hands folded in front of him, his mind reflecting on the years of struggle that had brought him to this point. He had never imagined a day like this, where the system that had tried to strip him of his heritage would finally be held accountable. Across the room, Judge Gregory Hawthorne sat at the bench, his expression cold and unreadable. But Amara could see it. The cracks were there, deep and undeniable. The facade of invincibility that he had worn for years was gone. The once powerful man was now nothing more than a desperate figure, clinging to the remnants of his power. Micah Reed, the investigative journalist who had been instrumental in uncovering the corruption, sat near the front, his eyes focused on the proceedings. Isaiah Mitchell, Harold's grandson, stood beside Amara, his posture straight and proud. Together, they had gathered the evidence that would bring the system down, but now they had to see it through. Amara rose to her feet, and the room fell into silence. "Your Honor, we have presented evidence of systemic corruption, racial discrimination, and abuse of power that has lasted for decades. We've shown that Judge Hawthorne and Brightwell Enterprises have colluded to rob black families of their land, using the courts as a weapon to erase their history." She turned toward the judge. her gaze steady and unflinching. The evidence is irrefutable. This is not just about one piece of land. It is about a pattern of exploitation, a history of oppression that stretches back generations. And today we ask this court to right the wrongs of the past and restore what has been taken. Harold Mitchell felt a weight lift from his chest as Amara spoke. For the first time in his life, he felt that his voice mattered, that his family's history wasn't just a forgotten story, but a truth that had the power to change everything. He had fought for so long, and now for the first time, he saw the possibility of a real victory. Judge Hawthorne's lips tightened, but he said nothing. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. It was only a matter of time before the court would issue its ruling. Amara continued, her voice unwavering. We ask for justice, not just for Mr. Mitchell, but for all the families who have been robbed of their land, their legacy, their dignity. This case is a reflection of the deep racial injustices that have plagued this country for centuries. It is time to acknowledge the truth and to hold those responsible accountable. As she finished speaking, a hush fell over the courtroom. The gallery, which had been filled with tension, now seemed to hold its collective breath. The fight for justice was no longer a battle of words. It was a battle for the future, for the generations who had come before, and those yet to come. The judge paused, looking over the evidence one last time. Finally, he spoke. This court finds Judge Gregory Hawthorne guilty of judicial misconduct, corruption, and racial discrimination. His actions have violated the trust of the people he was sworn to serve. Furthermore, Brightwell Enterprises is ordered to cease its development on the land in question, and the Mitchell family's claim to the land is hereby recognized and upheld. The words hit like a wave crashing against the shore. For a moment, Harold couldn't move. It was as if time itself had stopped. But then slowly, he rose to his feet, his legs shaking as he stood taller than he had in years. The weight of his family's history, their struggles, and their triumphs all seemed to come together in that moment. Amara smiled at him, her eyes reflecting the hard-won victory. We did it, Mr. Mitchell, she said softly. Outside, the crowds erupted in cheers. The news cameras, the reporters, and the supporters were all waiting for this moment. As Amara and Harold made their way out of the courthouse, they were greeted by a sea of people, their faces filled with hope and relief. Harold couldn't help but think of the little girl he had saved so many years ago. The memory of her terrified eyes locked onto his, her tiny hands clutching at him, was seared into his mind. He had saved her life, just as Amara had saved his. And now they had all come together to save something far bigger than land. They had saved a piece of their history. They had reclaimed their dignity. As the crowd cheered, Harold turned to Amara, a tear slipping down his weathered face. Thank you, he said simply, for believing in me, for believing in us. Amara smiled, her eyes shining with a quiet pride. You did this, Mr. Mitchell. Your fight, your courage. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants today. And as the sun began to set over the courthouse, casting a golden light on the land that had once been stolen but was now returned, Harold felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in decades. The fight wasn't over. There would be more battles ahead. But for the first time, he felt as though they were winning, and that was enough.